with some actual ideas for scripts or some of the scripts that I've planned that you'll be able to interact with your environment with and get some value out. So if you've got questions in the chat, hey, is there a way to do whatever? Go ahead and shout them out. If it's something I can show you guys quick, I will absolutely do it. Starting off, so regardless of whether you're using Microsoft's modules or the PnP module or things that you write on your own, you're going to have to deal with passwords. So I came from the SharePoint on-prem ecosystem, and with there, you just got into the server, RDP or whatever, you started PowerShelling and everything was fine because it knew who you were. You'd logged into Windows and all of that. Everything's in the cloud. We don't have that context anymore. So no matter what you're doing, you're going to have to give Office 365 a username and a password before you can go anywhere. Now, with all of the stuff going on in the world right now, we're very aware of the whole make things safe and secure, make things easy to use, and you got to figure out where on that spectrum every situation is. This next couple slides is kind of what I'm going to talk about. The most secure way to handle this is to use the get credential command or to just type any of these commands, the connect commands that I'm going to cover here in a few minutes, and they will prompt you for a username and password. That's the most secure because nothing's saved anywhere. There's no place hackers can grab anything. And that is most secure, but it's really annoying because you have to type your username and password all the time. And as we all know, you should have a different username and password for everything you log into, and the password should be a passphrase, so it should be really long. I hate typing passwords. I'm almost at the point now where I'll just let the bad guys have whatever, because whatever they do is worse or is not as bad to me as having to type all these passwords. But one of the great powers of PowerShell is to be able to script things, schedule things, automate things. And you can't automate anything if you got to type your password in every time you do it. So the next thing is a less annoying, but way less secure way to handle this. So we've gone from very safe and secure, but really uncomfortable to use to very easy to use, but way less secure. And that's just hard coding everything in your script. So hard coding your username, hard coding your password, and then converting it to something and then tricking the command list to use it. That is not very good, but it does work. I've got a blog post down here. If you download the slides, there's a way to do this with an encrypted file. So you can create a file that is on your file system that can only be unencrypted by the person who created it. It can only be unencrypted on the machine it was encrypted on. That's pretty secure. I did that for a long time. That was a good combination, or a good compromise between secure and easy to use. But the technology has advanced now. So a couple of years ago, I stumbled across this module called the Credential Manager. And this is a module, a PowerShell way to interact with the Windows Credential Manager. So the good news about this is you don't have to worry about writing any kind of security things. You just use, Microsoft's taking care of that. It's the Windows Credential Store. They make sure they keep it in RAM secure. They keep it on disk secure. You don't have to bother about any of that. You just use this PowerShell commandlet to pull those credentials out. So this is pretty good. I used this for a long time. It is in the PowerShell gallery. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. But you can just run this command, install Credential Manager. I added this scope thing at the end. PowerShell has this idea that you can run a PowerShell prompt as your user or as an administrator. And if you are not an administrator on a box, you can't install a module. So I put that scope current user to show you how to do it if you're not an admin. If you are an admin on your box like I am on my desktop, you can get rid of that scope part. Once you install that module, then it adds some commandlets and things like this whole new stored credential. So I can use that to create a credential that I will use to access Office 365 later. Or if I'm in the Windows Credential Manager, I can see where some have already been created. So like that admin 518, whatever. So then I can use some commandlets that come with that stored credential module to pull those out. So either way, it doesn't matter how you create them because it's just all Windows Credential Manager. So that worked really well for me. That's kind of the method that I use now. But I have found that, and this is how you can create one. So if I wanted to create a new one like I did with that PowerShell, this is how I would do it. And then when I use it, when I pull the name out, I say, get PS credential tenant admin. Now there are different types of credentials. So, and then this kind of does some foreshadowing here. The stored credential module, I used that for a long time. It worked great. And then a year or two ago, the PnP module, which I'm going to talk about later and fawn over a whole lot, added support for all of this. So I can use those same credentials that Microsoft is managing for us, keeping them safe and all that, but I can use that within my other modules without having to make sure that things aren't safe. If you do use the get PnP stored credential, you give it the name. You also have to give it the type, because is it smart enough to understand different types of credentials? And so you have to do the type PS credential to make it work. I'm going to show this later in some other examples, but this is by far my favorite way to handle passwords. I do this all the time. 100% of the Office 365 PowerShell that I run, I do with this. I never type a username and password, to the point where if I'm connecting to a new environment, I will not even use that username and password. I will save a credential for that environment the very first time I ever use it. I hate messing with passwords. So, and again, this obviously is important for Office 365, but this works for anything in the cloud. Azure, it works for websites. I host all the pages for my blog and my podcast on a SharePoint 2010 server. I use these same techniques to upload things to the document libraries on that server. It's all agnostic all the way across. Now, one of the things that we have now with Office 365 and Azure is this ability to force multi-factor auth or two-factor auth, MFA or TFA. So how does that work? How do you get around that when you're not wanting to interact with it? Well, you have to create an app password or some other techniques. These are, so kind of the thing that I wanted to mention with this, so I'm not going to get into this because this gets really ugly and it gets very crazy depending on what kind of authentication provider you're using. I'm showing how to do it with Azure right here, but if you're using Ping or Okta or any of these, the instructions are going to be a little different. But really what you want to figure out how to do is create an app password, and then you give that app account permissions to whatever, Azure, Office 365, and then you use that to log in. And this is an example of that I did. I created an app password, and you also might see this as like legacy credentials if something doesn't understand modern credentials. But that is an option. Don't think just because your environment uses MFA or TFA that you can't use PowerShell or that you have to disable it for those highly privileged accounts. Okay, so the password stuff's out of the way, and I've got a couple of blog posts on that, so feel free to go to toddklindt.com and search for that. So let's start off with the Microsoft modules. So these are the official modules that come from Redmond, signed, sealed, delivered from the folks at Microsoft. One of the great things about PowerShell is that there is a governing body, and that's changed over the years, but there's a governing body that sets out standards for PowerShell. So even if PowerShell modules are written by different groups, different companies, or even by different groups inside of the same company, they're mostly the same. So the techniques that you're learning about passwords will work with other things. One of the downsides of that is that they are mostly the same, not exactly the same. So every group does things a little bit differently. And that's important to keep in mind. It gets very frustrating, but it's important to keep in mind that Microsoft is a really big company, and the SharePoint group doesn't always know what the Exchange group is doing. The SharePoint group might know what the Exchange group's doing, but not think that it's the right thing to do for the SharePoint group. So the modules are just going to be ever so slightly different. What I will tell you with that is I will point those out as I go through these modules, but just know that they're going to work a little differently. It's going to be frustrating. It's just part of the game. But every technique that you learn will just make it that much easier the next time you have to learn another one. Before you can connect with any of these, and I did not format that slide very well. I'm using a new slide template inside of PowerPoint, and I screwed that up. Before you connect with any of these, you have to have these things in place. You have to be able to run PowerShell as an administrator. We all know lazy programmers who test everything as a local admin and a tenant admin and all of that. It's the only way they guarantee that they work. Now, I will tell you that is not always necessary. For instance, Exchange doesn't require it, but if you work at a place where you have a managed desktop and you have to fight for admin control and things like that, it is well documented that all these PowerShell commandlets require you to be able to run PowerShell as an administrator. And you have to be a global admin for a lot of them, not all of them. And again, these are the Microsoft ones. Exchange does not require it. Exchange was the first team to really get into the cloud and really get into PowerShell management of the cloud. So they're just a little bit ahead of everybody else. So they have a permission inside of the Exchange tenant where you can say has permission to run PowerShell. But everybody else, SharePoint, Skype, whatever, you got to be an admin for that group or a tenant admin to run it. You need to be running PowerShell 3 or later. Ideally, everybody now is running Windows PowerShell 5 or 5.1, something around it. That's what comes in Windows 10. You can find out which version you're running by running that command there, getting the variable PS version table, make sure that it says 3 or later, but ideally it would be 5. Windows, or not, I guess not Windows PowerShell. We had PowerShell back in the day, and then it got pulled into the Windows groups. Then it was Windows PowerShell forever, and then they kind of branched it off so it would run on other things. So then there was Windows PowerShell and PowerShell Core, and then Windows or PowerShell 7 came out here a month or so ago, and it's all been brought back together. So now it's just PowerShell 7, not Windows PowerShell 7, not PowerShell Core 7, PowerShell 7. So it's kind of all come full circle. None of these modules, nothing that I show you today will work with PowerShell 7. The Microsoft modules won't work. The PnP modules won't work. They just do things a little differently. The good news, though, is you can have PowerShell 7 and PowerShell 5 installed in the same box at the same time. I have that. There's no reason you should not install PowerShell 7 and get comfortable with it, because obviously all these modules will eventually support it. But just know that when you do the Office things, you'll have to run the Windows PowerShell 5.1 host. Your execution policy for PowerShell needs to be remote signed. And if you have a problem, the error message will be very obvious about that. Basically, that says that if a module comes down from another machine, it has to be signed by a certificate. And you also need the sign-in assistant, which is an authentication piece that Microsoft has to install. There's a link there on that. And that picture there that's blocking the important letters just shows you how to run as administrator. So that's for all of these, all the things I'm going to talk about from Microsoft. Those are all that. So now we're going to get into the modules themselves. Again, every team at Microsoft has had to write their own PowerShell modules. So this is maddening, trying to keep track of what you need to install to do what. I would love to tell you there's a secret to it. I kind of have a secret at the end of this section, but just know for the most part, it's going to be maddeningly frustrated. And once you really get into this, you're going to have multiple modules installed at the same time and interacting with different command sets. And that's just the way that it is. I will also tell you, and I've left one for my examples at the end, I've left evidence of this. There's a very obvious journey that you make with PowerShell. And it's, and I don't want to get into all of it, but, it's going to be running a single command to get some information, running a single command and piping it to another command to, filter or sort or whatever, writing stringing a bunch of them together on a big, really long one-liner, and then figuring out how you can save it in files and then writing the modules. There's a very obvious progression. Don't be ashamed of where you're at in that progression. I'm going to show you some things that I did poorly, and I left them in on purpose just to kind of show that growth pattern. But being frustrated about which modules you use and how to interact with them is just part of that process. I went through it. For those of you that do SharePoint, the only reason I use PowerShell today is because SharePoint forced me to 10 years ago. And the first thing that I tried to figure out how to do with the SharePoint PowerShell was to create a new site collection. That's a process that I could have done blindfolded in Central Admin in about 7 seconds, probably. It was something I had done a million times. The first time that I did it in PowerShell, it probably took me an hour. That's just how it is. I've obviously progressed a little bit since then, so don't let that get frustrating. The getting up to speed on PowerShell is tough, but it's well worth it. You'll get through it. So I bring that up because to connect to Azure AD, there are 2 different modules, and really 3 different modules if I want to get into the weeds a little bit, because there's 2 versions of the Azure AD one. Either one is fine. I use them both interchangeably. The MSOL one, the Microsoft Online module, is the older of the 2. It's not actively being updated anymore. They're not doing anything new with it, but it works completely fine. I use it a lot, mostly out of inertia, just because I've used it a lot. It's baked into a lot of my scripts, but it's fine. To connect to that, first you need to have an account. So I've got this my account variable that I'm using. I'm using the PnP credential manager to get a stored credential, that one I created earlier called tenant name, telling it which type to do. Now I've got this credential stored in that variable, and I use connect MSOL service and that credential to get me connected. You'll notice you don't have to give the command any context. No tenant names, no URLs, just your username. It's going to pull back everything that that user has access to. Now, all of these commandlets do a pretty good job of adhering to the idea that no news is good news. So if you do a connect MSOL service, if everything runs great, you will get no response. It'll just kick you right back to your prompt. I'm a little more highly strung than that, so I like to make sure that things work. So I will usually do something like get MSOL user or get MSOL domain just to get some affirmation that things have been working. I don't do that when in my scripts, but I certainly do it when I'm interacting and trying to write things. To see what all that module has for you, you can do get command module MS online. MS online. The other thing is most of these commandlets do a good job, not all of them, but most of them do a good job of putting prefixes on their nouns. And so you're going to have get-MSOL user as opposed to just get user. Because if you're doing get user, is it a Windows user? Is it a domain user? Is it a Azure user? Whatever. So all modules should have prefixes on their nouns so that those commandlets don't clobber each other. So you can also do something like get command -noun MSOL star, and it will give you all the commandlets that use that. Either way is fine, doesn't matter. But that will give you all the idea of all the different things you can do. To connect with Azure AD, very similar. The Azure AD is the next version of that. And most of the commandlets are the same where it makes sense. So connect makes sense. Yeah, the user makes sense. Here, I've chosen, instead of pulling a stored account from get PnP stored credential, I'm using the get credential commandlet that's built into PowerShell and just getting popped up. So when I type my account equal get credential, I'm going to get a dialog box. I'm going to type in a username and password. PowerShell is going to store that as a variable and then use that to connect. The important thing with that is get credential doesn't test the credentials, it just stores them and encrypts them. So you can type the right username and the wrong password. Get credential doesn't care, happy to save it for you. But then when you connect, you're going to get something like forbidden or bad password. So I've fallen for that more times than I care to admit. Again, connect Azure AD. No news is good news. It just kicks back. So I'll do something like get Azure AD user just to make sure everything's going well. And then I can do commands on that. One fun lesson that I learned when I was a budding PowerShell with Office 365 user was I had a situation where I had to change all of the passwords in my tenant for something. It was a demo tenant. I had seen some issues where somebody was presenting a similar deck to this. One of the people in the audience had seen their admin tenant username and password when they typed it in and had logged into their tenant while this person was speaking and destroyed part of their presentation. I don't know why someone would do that. I don't know if they weren't held enough as a kid, didn't get enough hugs from their mother. I don't know what produces a person like that. But I figured if it would happen to that person, surely I could raise somebody's ire enough that it would happen to me. So I wanted to make sure and change all my passwords because at that time, the demo tenants that Microsoft gave out all had the same password. Everybody knew what it was. So I had to change that. So I didn't know how to do that at the time. So I used some just standard PowerShell troubleshooting. I did get command star password star. And I found this commandlet set MSOL user password, which was pretty much exactly the thing that I wanted. I was a little surprised that it asked for the password in plain text, which meant that my password would show up in my transcript in plain text or whatever. That was a little odd. The Azure AD version of this commandlet uses a secure string, which it probably should. So I kind of looked through that and I'm like, all right, I've got this. So again, I wanted to change the password for every account in my tenant because this is a demo tenant. So this is the glory of PowerShell. I can automate things. I can use the pipe. So I said get MSOL user. It gave me all my users. I piped that to set MSOL user password. It understood taking a user as a pipe bind. So it said, happy to do it, Todd. Changed all my passwords to that. And I was the smartest man alive. Until I realized about 2 weeks later that I had broken the user synchronization because PowerShell had done exactly what I told it to. It had gotten every user, including my sync account user, and changed the password, but I hadn't noticed that. So the sync account on-prem, I hadn't changed the syncing software. So be very careful when you do this. Have a test environment. I love the automation of PowerShell, but it's kind of like, Fire or any of these kind of things. It's a great tool, but you have to have a healthy respect for it. So I did make some make some messes with that one, but turned out fine. I was able to fix that back up. The next module I'm going to talk about is the Exchange module. So to do any kind of user creation, setting up domains for email or SharePoint or whatever, you have to use Azure AD, MS Online. We've covered that. Kind of the next one you really need to know is Exchange. I mentioned before that Exchange was the first product group to really embrace the cloud with Exchange Online, and also their management tools, same. So PowerShell is something they've been doing for a long time. They do it just a little differently than all the other modules do. And this is one of those things, it's the same but different. So they use a thing called PowerShell remoting. PowerShell remoting is not unique to Office 365 or Exchange. It's a way to get into remote servers and do things without RDPing into them. They built on top of that. But because of that, they don't have a module that you install and all that. They do this thing where you connect to a session and download the modules. It's a little odd, but totally doable once you get used to it. And this transcript here is just me doing that. And I've got another slide here that actually walks you through it. But this is where that whole remote signed execution policy comes in. Also, you need to have access to port 80 outgoing. So some security folks don't like that, but that's one of the requirements for this. And it does open up a remote session. So what you don't want to do is just close your PowerShell window when you get done. You want to do this whole remove PS session thing. And it does support MFA. There's some ways to get around that. There's an article linked on there. So this is what it looks like when you connect in, and same sort of deal. I connect the way that I have to connect. I import the session. Everything probably looks fine. I do a get mailbox, which just gives me a list of all the mailboxes in my tenant to make sure that it's all good. And then I go in and start, creating mailboxes or changing mailbox settings, whatever. I know most of you are probably SharePoint folks, but you will end up doing the Exchange bit because since Exchange was the first ones out there, there's a bunch of settings that impact you in other places, impact you in SharePoint, impact you in Teams that you have to make in Exchange. So understanding how all of this works will definitely help you with that. A couple of things that I found out about this. The Microsoft documentation says that you are limited to 3 of these sessions per tenant. I found that not to be the case. I've had more than 3 open at a time. I'm crazy like that. I'm a wild man. My guess is they put that in place for times like these when their service is, being taxed as hard as it can. They can go in and make some extra headroom by reducing you down without violating any terms of service. So know that, but that's also a good reason to remove those PS sessions. Also, you don't have to be a tenant admin to do this. There is a PowerShell permission that you can give a particular user to make them an Exchange admin without giving them the keys to everything. So this is that whole get mailbox and all of that. I'm not going to walk through all the Exchange stuff. The slides are out there. You can take a look at them, but I don't have the luxury of time to walk through all of this. It's creating a mailbox for my wife. She's very excited about that. It's kind of how all that looks. One thing I will mention about this, because it does pertinent to all cloud things, because we're not on the machine doing the thing. So again, I came from the SharePoint world, what I would RDP into a SharePoint box and do PowerShell, and it would take effect immediately. This is in the cloud. So we have this idea of queuing and all this. So this one is a great example where I created the mailbox for my wife, and it looks fine and it's good to go, but you'll notice that it gave me a message that said, this mailbox might not be available for 15 minutes because I am going out there and I'm creating it in the cloud and things are getting queued up and they have to keep their services up. So just know that some of those things don't work exactly the way that we're used to working on-prem. So I will cover those when they show up, but this was one that was new to me when I first started using this. One thing that you have to do, whether you're doing Exchange or whatever, is licensing the mailboxes. So if you do end up automating some part of your provisioning, your onboarding process, creating the user is not enough. You also have to set the user's location, because different locations have different licensing rules, and then set a license for that user. Now, there's some easy ways around that now. You can license by group, some other things that weren't available a couple of years ago, but just know if you get any weird errors, it might be because of licensing. Having the user created is not enough. And there's that user licensed. Okay, so we've covered the authentication bit, Microsoft Online or Azure AD. We've covered now the Exchange bit. Now we're on to the SharePoint module. The SharePoint module, I've always been just a little disappointed with. So call it 5 years ago, I forget when exactly it was. I did a session for a conference in Australia on PowerShell with SharePoint Server, so on-prem SharePoint Server. It was a big hit. They loved me, of course, much excitement. When they invited me back to the conference the next year, it was when the cloud was starting to become popular. They said the PowerShell session was very popular, went gangbusters. We would like that session again, but we would like it for SharePoint Online. Could you do that? I don't know if you've ever been to Australia or New Zealand, but I would say yes to just about anything that would get me to Australia or New Zealand. So I said, absolutely, I could do that. At the time, SharePoint Server, the PowerShell snap-in, because it's not a module, the snap-in that came with SharePoint Server had 600 and some commandlets, something like that. When I started writing that session for the Australians down there, I pulled in the SharePoint Online module, and it had 32 commandlets, maybe. So basically, the joke that I told then was that I was going to have to spend 2 minutes on each commandlet to fill up my 60 minutes. How it ended up working, I'll tell you later how I filled that time out. I had a dance routine that they set up and all that. But it has always been a little far behind. Now, as of the current version of this commandlet, I think we've got 166 commandlets, something like that. SharePoint Server 2019, by comparison, has 860, something like that. But you are going to be a little disappointed if you've used the SharePoint on-prem PowerShell module. It is getting better, but it's not where I would like it to be. It does allow just kind of some high-level basic manipulation of your SharePoint Online tenant and your Azure AD tenant. Things like users and groups, tenant level settings that you might need, security things, policies like that. Site collection specific settings, sharing settings. Other tenant level functionality that's come out, hub sites. This is how one of the ways you can create hub sites and hub families and all that. The multi-geo functionality when it came out, this was the way that you managed that as well. To get this is now in the PowerShell gallery. You used to have to download an exe. Now it's in the PowerShell gallery. They're almost there. They don't have a nice name, so you have to give the whole namespace, but install module, Microsoft Online, SharePoint, PowerShell. I recommend doing everything from the PowerShell gallery if you can. I'll cover that a little bit later on why that's a good idea. But if you have installed this because you needed to do something and did the exe version, my recommendation would be to uninstall that. Go find the location on your file system, and that's something I can help you with if you need help. On the file system, burn that out with fire. Reboot your box a couple of times. Whoever your favorite deity is, I reach out to them, offer some sacrifices, and then come back in and install this one because it'll be easier to update, things like that. So this is how you would connect with that. So we've got our my account variable that we set either by get PnP stored credential or by get credential or however. We're going to use the same thing here. So connect SPO service. This one you do need to give a namespace. You do need to give a URL, and it's the URL to the SharePoint admin center. So it's going to be your tenant name -admin.sharepoint.com and then your credential. One place that tripped me up on this a lot was when I was talking about my tenant, or if I had a cloud only account, that would be something like todd@tenant.onmicrosoft.com, but then this was tenant.sharepoint.com. Getting your head wrapped around all that's a little tricky sometimes, but you do it a few times, you get used to it. So you use the connect SPO service, that gets you in. Again, no news is good news. And then get SPO site gives you your site collections, and that's kind of how you know you're connected. That get commandlet there will tell you what you can do it there. And I have in my notes that there are 173 commandlets now. So well done, SharePoint team. Keep up that good work. The next one is Microsoft Teams. They were a little late to the show. Their module only came out a year or so ago, but you can also do that. So install module Microsoft Teams. There's a connect. I don't remember if they have a prefix yet. So the Exchange doesn't have a prefix. SharePoint has a prefix. All of the nouns will be prefixed with SPO, which makes it easier to get SPO site. I don't remember if Teams does. Part of that is because all of these different groups, the module is managed and written by people who know that product really well, but don't know PowerShell very well. So one of the later modules I'm going to talk about here, the Microsoft Graph, that team, the Graph team wrote that, and I was involved in the beta process of that. And I said, oh, everything's great, but you need to add a prefix. And they're like, nah, nobody does that. I'm like, everybody does that. When you put this out, everybody's going to complain about this. And they're like, nah, you're crazy. Nobody's going to complain about this. They put it out, everybody complained about it. So with Teams, I don't remember if they've added one yet, but this also comes down to the crazy naming thing. Was the prefix team, but then the noun is team, so it would be a get-team, whatever. One of the conventions with PowerShell is that the nouns should always be singular, so it's not get SPO users, it's get SPO user. So then would it be get team, get MS team? There's some logistics there, but you can always do the whole get command module Microsoft Teams to see what's in there. And I'll come in a few slides. I'll talk about why you maybe want to use that. Some of the things you can do. On the heels of that, we have Skype for Business. Now, I know what you're probably thinking, that Skype for Business is a dead product, and I'm just using this to fluff up my slide count. You're half right. That's there's some prestige that comes from having a large slide deck. But in all reality, since Teams grew somewhat out of Skype for Business, there are a bunch of Teams settings that sometimes you set in Teams, but sometimes you have to set with the Skype for Business module. That's gotten better with age, but the last time I checked, there were 50 commandlets in the Skype for Business module that referenced Teams. So you probably have to do this one. I also mentioned this one because it is the worst module ever. Of all these modules, I hate this one the most. I don't hate any of the ones. I do hate this one. There's some code that you have to download and install. The PowerShell module that you install for this forces a reboot. I've never had a PowerShell module in my life force a reboot, but this one did it. And then you have to import a thing. I've got the list. There's legitimately like 10 steps to getting this thing working. 10 things you have to do before you can get to the spot where you do the stuff that's on the screen here. So if you are serious about your Teams management, I would install this one sooner. One of the things I stumbled across for a customer was they wanted to set up a mailbox, or not a mailbox, a voicemail box. Customer was 100% Teams, had never touched Skype for Business in their life. There was one setting that they had to set that was in this module. Took that person 2 hours probably to do it because they had to download the thing, reboot the thing, get all that to make one change for something in Teams. So that's the kind of problems that show up with this. The other thing to keep in mind about this is the Skype for Business product has had many names over the years, and the commandlets, bless their hearts, they represent that. So some of the commandlets have Teams as the noun, some have communication server, LCS, link. It's ugly out there. The other thing is we've got that whole get command and module trick that we can use. This creates like a temp module. So the last time I installed it, the get command, the module name was TMP_ random characters. It's just a mess all the way around. So if you do much with Teams, I would recommend installing this early so that you have a couple hours to fight it. Not to be outdone, Power Automate, the cloud product previously known as Flow, and Power Apps, the product previously known as Power Apps No Space. They also have modules in here. Once again, these modules very clearly were written by a team that knows their product very well, doesn't know PowerShell very well, so they're a little fudgety, fuss bucket. They're tough to use, but once you get them in there and play with them a little bit, they sort of sort themselves out. And I've got some examples on how to use those. One thing that they have done differently is they really want to empower the end user. So there's a module for user level things and a module for administration tasks, and you need to install them separately. And bless their hearts, they have the same commandlet names in the two different modules in some cases. So you'll have to do the allow clobber that I've got on the second one. It's a mess. I can't begin to apologize enough for it. The other thing about this is you need to have certain licensing for the admin level things. I think it's my notes say the power or the plan 2, the P2 plan. I haven't tested that lately to see if that's still the case. But if you try the admin stuff and it doesn't work, it might be a licensing issue. So keep that in mind. One of my new favorites is the Graph module. They call it the Graph SDK. I push back against that because I'm not a developer, so I don't like anything with software development kit in it. But this is a PowerShell module for the Microsoft Graph. As we've seen, everywhere that the graph rears its ugly head, the graph just has its fingers in everything. And so what you can do with this one is nearly infinite because it can do users, it can do SharePoint, it can do whatever. Well, once again, there is a bunch of things that you can only do in the graph. So you should get familiar with this one as early as you can. They right now have a project on GitHub where you can grab that, and I screwed this up. I'll cover it in another slide, but you can install it from the PowerShell gallery, but they do have a GitHub project where you can submit discussions and things like that. The GitHub project is helpful for no other reason they have some samples in there. So it's just good to see how that works. The graph is like speaking a foreign language, but harder because you don't log in as a user, you log in with scopes and all of this. And this module is still very much in beta, and it shows. One of the things that they have done, so basically the graph is huge, and they have made the decision along with some of the Azure folks that the surface area of the product, in this case graph, is too huge for a human or a group of humans or 10,000 monkeys with typewriters to write the commandlets manually. So they use this process called auto rest that basically hits the API and looks at every API interface and then generates a PowerShell commandlet for it. The last time I looked, the number of commandlets in this beta SDK was north of 800. There are tons of them because it's hitting every API interface and generating command for it. It's just unwieldy, very tough to use. But the good news about that is they're very open to input. I've been working a lot with the team and telling them, again, the prefix thing, they had to hear that a couple of times. But just a couple of days ago, I was trying to do something with this. I couldn't figure it out. I pinged a guy in the team and he's like, oh, yeah, we should add that. And hopefully by the end. So I did that 2 days ago. And the developer on the team said, oh, yeah, we'll add that by the end of the month. And then the product manager was like, today is the end of the month. He's like, oh yeah, at the end of next month, the end of April. So they are very open to input on that. So this is one I've struggled with how to use this because it is so different, both the graph itself and the PowerShell, that it's a struggle to use. But I have been trying to get it because there is some good stuff in there. Another one of the things that I find myself manipulating a lot in Office 365 is unified groups or Office 365 groups. There is no module for this. They all get managed through other modules, and how they get managed is something I'm going to talk about in a couple of slides, but there is no groups module. So some of it you can do with the Azure MSOL side, some of it in Exchange, Teams does some of it. The PnP does some, the graph does some. And there's a lot of overlap. So which tool to use depends a lot on what the thing that you want to do is, if it only happens in one module, or if you're already in a module with something else. So one of the things that I try to do, especially as I'm writing scripts for customers, is if I have to use the PnP module for something, then I do everything in the PnP module. Because what I don't want is for the customer to, when I deliver that, say to the customer, okay, you need to install this module. Oh, and you need to install the SPO module because I use that for something. Oh, and then there's this thing I did in the MSO. If I don't have to do that, I don't. If I can do it all in one module, I do. So as you're trying to decide for groups or anything else, if everything can be done in one module, go that way. Those are all the modules. So this is just kind of a recap. Here are the pieces that you have to download and install. And this is, again, so when you download the slides, you can kind of go to this slide. And the sign-on bit, some of those kind of things. And I should rejigger this slide a little bit too. And then these are the modules that I talked about. And I don't have the graph on here. But so if you just wanted to say all this stuff is good, Todd, you could just highlight all the PowerShell in here and spit it out. I have a blog post, one of my favorite blog posts I've ever written, and that's saying a lot. All my blog posts are like my children, trying to pick my favorites. Very difficult, but this would be one of the favorites. And this is a blog post that lists all of the modules that I use when I interact with Office 365, what the current version is, so that you can see if the version you have is the current version or not, and then how to install each of them. So this is, I literally go to this one all the time. If I'm setting up a new machine, I go here to get my new machine hydrated with all the great PowerShell modules. And then if you go to my blog, and you should go there all the time, a lot of good stuff there. Up at the top, I have a link up there. So this screenshot kind of has two important things about it. It's got the link up there that shows you wherever you're at on my blog, you can just get there by clicking the 065 PowerShell modules. The other thing is that it is the year 2020, and as society is collapsing around us, I'm still rocking a SharePoint 2010 site for my blog. universally recognized as one of the premier blogging platforms. But SharePoint 2010 right there just really got that out there. So one of the problems once you have modules installed is how to keep them updated. These things get updated monthly most of the time, so there's always new things out there. So you can use find module to get the current version, and I should have looked at the slide a little better to get the fonts better. That will give you the current version of any module. You can use get installed module to see what version you have of that module that's installed. And that's kind of an example here. So update module, whatever, SharePoint Online, Azure, whatever. But because I love you all so very much, you mean so much to me, I've written a second blog post on this topic. And this one is just a blog post on how to update PowerShell modules you already have installed. So Jack likes this one, an oldie but a goodie. Thanks, Jack. You're my favorite. I'm gonna go into Teams. I'm gonna give that a heart because that means the world to me, Jack. There you go. And a thumbs up. Can I do both? Absolutely. Oh, that took the heart away. There we go. So I literally do this one all the time. And this one, I indulged myself a little bit. I showed the command that I use, and then I broke down what each piece does, because what this blog post does is it only tells you if modules need to be updated. It doesn't actually update them, because not all modules handle that well, and I didn't feel comfortable automating that and putting that out on the web. But I do break it down so that you can see what the pieces are, and I've got my own private version of this that does update the module, so I can run it. I've got a function that I wrote that looks to see if there's any updates, and then if there are, I can do a dash update, and it updates all the modules that I have. So, but I broke that down so you guys could put that together yourself. One of my favorite blog posts. All right, so that is the modules that Microsoft has provided us, how to install them, how to update them. Let's talk about some new stuff. I mentioned my trip to Australia and how I had 32 commandlets and 60 or 75 minutes, I forget, to talk about them all, and how I didn't want to bore all the Aussies with 2 minutes per commandlet. At the time, and again, these were dark ages, the only way that we could do additional things with PowerShell was to use CSOM, the client-side object model. Now, I'm not going to belabor this much, but it's important for a couple of things. Number one, we've come a long way since all this happened. So this used to be the code that it took to connect to Office 365. That's all this does, is it just connects you to Office 365. Now we've got a single command. This does it all. I bring this up because the PowerShell PnP that I'm going to talk about in a minute is based on this. It's based on the client-side object model. So that means anything that you can do to SharePoint from a client, like your web browser, you can do with PowerShell. You can either do it with the PnP or you can write something like this. It's all hitting the client-side interface. So this was connecting back in my day when we wanted to connect to Office 365. We had to walk uphill with our keyboards. We had to type 14 lines. This was all the code that it took to get an SPO web. It was just horrible. But that's what we did at the time. We had to code every one of them from scratch, or go to our developer friends with our hat in our hand and say, hey, could you spare some coding time and write me a module, please? Fortunately, things got much better. So several years ago, Microsoft started this idea of the patterns and practices. And basically, this was guidance for developers and say, these are the patterns and the practices you should use when you're developing against SharePoint. Is that right? Web parts and event handlers and all of that stuff. One of the things that they did was they provided PowerShell snippets. If you're going to write PowerShell that interacts with Office 365, here are the patterns and practices you should use. And the world embraced it with open arms and said, this is the greatest thing ever. So here we are several years later. The PnP PowerShell is going strong. It's an indispensable tool that everybody who uses Office 365, administrates it, runs it, whatever, should use. There are over 400 commandlets in here. So if you remember, the SPO module has 170 some. We've got, nearly 3 times as many here, and it is great. Now, GitHub is kind of a scary developer-y place, but now they've got this in the PowerShell gallery, so you don't need to go into GitHub, but you can if you want to see the code. It's all open source. You can get everything in there. I touch this every single day. I could not do my job without this. I can't emphasize enough how important it is to get this installed and get familiar with it. It works with all of the SharePoints. This session is about SharePoint Online. That's what I'm kind of hitting on, but it also works with on-prem SharePoints, and it's scoped at the site collection level. So it's a little different. It's not the tenant level. So this is just a short look at all of the commands that are out there. This module, I'm not going to talk about a lot. You can grab the deck. We're running short on time, but here are some of my favorites. Here's ways to upload files. I talked about how you can use this to manage groups. We've got some session or some commandlets over there that talk about that. If you want to manipulate views or fields, things like that, it's all in there. Manipulating list items, every bit of it is in there. If you need to, change the modified date on a file so that, because you migrated it over and now it's got the modified date as today when really it was 10 years ago, you can do all that. It's great. As I've mentioned this to some people, some customers, I've seen pushback because security folks or pointy-haired bosses or whoever don't like it because it didn't come from Microsoft. I'm not going to go through all of this. This is really just a cheat sheet for you if you ever need to have that fight, but it is absolutely legit. Microsoft runs this. Vesa Juvonen works at Microsoft in SharePoint engineering. He is the guy that owns this. The guy, the non-Microsoft guy that runs it, used to work at a company that evaluated code to make sure that it was safe and written correctly. Microsoft signs it every month with their own key. And there's no more blessing that they could give it. So if you have that discussion, that's where you should go. So I said I did this slide. There we go. So then it comes down to so I was talking to some people that I've tutored on PowerShell before and said, what should I talk about? And this is one of the tasks that they mentioned that's a good one. The SPO PowerShell and the PnP PowerShell overlap a bit. So how do you know when to use one over the other? I talked about it a little bit. If you're writing something that requires some PnP, then try to do everything in PnP. Don't try to mix and match if you don't have to. But this is kind of how I see about it. If I want to do a tenant-wide task, if I want to set a value for something, the SPO commandlet probably works. Really basic things the SPO module works for. When Microsoft releases new functionality, like when Geos came out, when Hubs came out, the only way that you could set those was with the SPO module. You couldn't do it in SharePoint Admin Center yet. There was another way to do it. So those kind of tasks you're going to have to do with SPO. And then any new functionality that the PnP hasn't looked at and stolen yet, again, the Hubs and Geos for a couple of months, those are the kind of things that you want to do in the SPO module. The PnP, kind of the counter to that, anytime you want to do a site-specific setting, because you connect to a site collection, not to the tenant session. You want to do that there. Because you're connecting to the site collection, you don't have to be a SharePoint tenant admin to connect. You just use whatever permissions your user has. If you are a site owner, you can connect to the PnP PowerShell and do site things, upload files, do whatever, change settings. You don't have to be a tenant admin. You don't even have to be a site collection admin. If you are only a member of a site, you can use the PnP PowerShell to upload files, because it just is using CSOM. If you can do it in a browser, you can do it here. The smallest object that the SPO module deals with is an SPO site, whereas with the PnP, you can get down to the property of a file, of a folder, of a document library, of a web, of a site. So it gets you down to those smaller, more specific sites. And then honestly, if you just want to be cooler, if you just want more respect from your coworkers and things like that, PnP PowerShell is where it's at. You just can't be cooler than that. Something I would be remiss if I didn't mention is where you would do all this wonderful PowerShell at. I'm an old school guy. I do a lot of my PowerShell just in a PowerShell prompt because that's how I've always done it. I was doing PowerShell before we had a lot of these good tools. And so that's just where I do it out of inertia, but there are better environments. One of them is VS Code. Between you and me, VS Code does not stand for Victoria's Secret. It stands for Visual Studio. I feel a little dirty using Visual Studio anything, so I only ever refer to this as code or VS Code. That helps with the illusion a little bit. VS Code is not just for those developers. It's for admins such as myself. I was kind of shamed into using this a few months ago by Mark Anderson, a developer friend of mine, because I was using the ISE in the command line and he was telling me I should use this and I was telling him that he was wrong and he was making fun of my hair, and boy, isn't quarantine hair. Whew. Quarantine has not been a friend to my my haircut. But anyway, so I quietly started playing with it just so I could tell him all the reasons why he was wrong, that I shouldn't use it. And turns out he was not wrong, and I use it all the time. I have on my workstation right now 2 instances of VS Code running for different projects that I'm working on. It is great. So things to keep in mind, it is a free download. You can go to code.visualstudio.com and just download it. It is not for PowerShell. It does all kinds of things. You can edit XML files and JSON files and Markdown and all that. But if you do PowerShell, Microsoft has a PowerShell extension that adds, the coloring and all that. So once you go in there on the left, there's a thing where you can see it there, the little blocks on the left. That's the extensions, and then you just type PowerShell. You can get the PowerShell module. I love it. I could not do my job without this tool. Another thing that I would like to mention is Microsoft has released the new Windows terminal that kind of replaces the con host that we all know. So this can be command prompts, this can be PowerShell core, Windows PowerShell, whatever. I've started using this. It's very beta-y, but this is kind of the wave of the future. It's got the tabbed interface across the top, and you can see that I can add a command prompt, Windows PowerShell, which is PowerShell 5, PowerShell 7, Azure Cloud Shell, all of that. You can install it from the Windows Store, free download. There's a GitHub project where you can see some stuff on it. It is very ugly. For instance, you can see in the screenshot the setting. Click the settings. You know what that takes you to? Not a screen of settings like you would think of. It opens up your favorite text editor with the JSON file that is the settings for the entire Windows terminal. So some rough edges, but it's there. Okay, so I know that I'm supposed to stop in a minute, and I've been watching the chat. I've kept most of you except for Tony. He just left. Tony, you missed the best part. I am going to spend some time doing some examples because I know those are always helpful. But if you go, I will bring that slide up that has the QR code on. I'll bring that up quickly so that you can see how to get these, because all the examples and all of that will be in that slide deck. So let me, that way, if you all have to run back from lunch or something, you can do that. Okay, so that's me again, rocking my Omaha shirt. ToddKlindt.com/OmahaSpug QR code. Give you a couple of seconds to hit that with your phone, and then I'm going to jump back. Like this is like the after party. We'll walk through some of the examples. And Dave, if you need to get the big hook and pull me off, come off mute and let me know. All right, we're okay. All right, you're a brave man. All right, so back.
Keep talking until everybody leaves.
I've done that before. That won't be the first time I've done that. So the first example that I had, and this was one that is very helpful, is just uploading a file, like just dropping a file into SharePoint. Because there's a lot of examples where you might want to do that. You've got a report that runs nightly, or you've got to migrate some documents from a file share, whatever. Here is how you can just upload a file to SharePoint. Nothing to it. So I've defined my location. Again, because and this is using the PnP PowerShell. So my site collection, I've defined the folder name, shared documents, and then I connect, and I'm connecting as Megan B. So I'm not even an admin. I'm nobody. I'm just Megan. I'm just a worker just trying to get my job done. And then I use Add-PnPFile. I give it the path to the local version of the file, and then the folder that I'm putting it in, and it just uploads it. And there's nothing to it. So I use this one all the time. I mentioned that I use SharePoint 2010 to host my things. This is exactly the way that I upload files for my podcast. If I want to add a folder, I bring this one up for a couple of reasons. Number one, because the folder parameter for Add-PnPFile isn't the folder inside of the document library. It is the document library and the folder. So I kind of wanted to show this one just so you all could see folder doesn't exactly mean folder, but here I created a folder in shared documents called folder 1 and then added a file to that. And now there are also commandlets get PnP folder, which will show you if you've got subfolders and all of that you can get into. And then get PnP property. Again, since this is the cloud, when we do gets, get SPO site, get PnP site, whatever, we're pulling this back, but there's a big XML blob that has every possible property of this object. And because this is over the web, the cloud doesn't know whether you're getting one of these or 100,000 of these. So it doesn't give you every property. It gives you the schema, but not the property. Get PnP property is the way to go back and say, I've got this item, I've got this folder, this document library. I want to get some more properties about it. Help get PnP property explains it all, but I think the folder property for the subfolder property of a property is one of those that doesn't automatically come down. Get PnP property is the way to get that for you. One of the things that I had to do for a customer a couple of years ago, and I don't know if this code works anymore, was to get which files were shared inside of document libraries. So sharing a file in SharePoint Online, there's about 14 different ways you can do it, and they all write their values to different places. It's maddening. But this one I like to show because it showed, again, I'm connecting as Megan B. I'm nobody important here. I just have permission to this site. But the things that I like that this does is it shows how to get the list of document libraries. And so I use get PnP list to do that. And then includes, which lets me define what properties that I get. I got crazy with my mouse there. So I want the default view URL and then whether it's a system list or not. And the reason I want that is because then I'm going to filter it. So I'm going to say where the property is system list is false. So I don't want those document libraries that are assets and all that kind of stuff. I only want shared documents and the things that users create. And then I only want the ones that are document libraries. So I don't want lists. I just want document libraries. And then once I've got that in the doc lives variable, I've got the collection, then I can use this for each and I can say for every doc live in there, get me a list of all the items that are in there. And then I can say walk through that. And for every document in there, look for the property shared with users. And if it is not equal to null, then output the name of the file and the user. So this is super ugly. There was a security thing that we had to do very quick, so I just kind of threw this together. This is one of those things where I am not proud of this code. It is terrible code, but I've evolved from this, and I wanted to show you guys that it's okay to write terrible code because you will get out of it. And I think actually this one, get in here. I think I put these in code. So I think I have this in here. Yeah. No, that's the next one. Maybe that was this one. Yeah. So this is Visual Studio Code. Let me blow this up for you a little bit. So this is just what it looks like when you're doing this. And this was me writing it in, and you can see. So I'm walking through, just writing output, just spitting it out to the screen. Pretty ugly. Not proud of this code. I had a similar project that I had to do for a customer where I had to spit out some compliance label information. So I bring this one in because I reused a bunch of code. I have a couple of PS1 files that are just snippets of code that I use all the time. And this is an example. So for instance, this bit right here, where I get the lists, and I get specific properties, and I don't want the system lists, and I do only want the document libraries. That is exactly the same code here. I just copied and pasted it from one file into another. And then this whole bit right here, same deal. I have a skeleton, a bit of code that does all this, and I just pasted it in here and then wrote my code in. And that's perfectly fine. I do this all the time. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. So for this one, I was just looking for some compliance information, and I needed the document library title. And then this one was one of those where when I got the document library, I didn't get all the compliance information that I needed and all these properties. So I went out and I got the documents out of the document library. And then for all of the documents, I said, get PnP property, passed the current item through, and then said, get me the file, the content type, and the compliance info, because that's what I wanted to exit or put out for the customer. That's what they wanted. And then instead of just spitting it out to the screen with write output, this is one of those things that I did better. Instead, I created a custom object and then formatted it that way. This is very much an advanced move, but what this lets me do is this lets me put it on the pipeline. So I can run this, and then it spits out the things, and then I can run that through select object and say, select only the compliance type, or I can run it through where object and say, only give me the things where the compliance type equals something. Because I spit it out as an object, I can put it down the pipeline for something else. So again, this is, you will evolve. Don't be ashamed of bad code. This one is one of my favorites. This one came from a very unhappy customer. You can read the whole story here. Basically, they had a user that was syncing a document library from Office 365, had no idea what any of that meant, saw that Office 365 was getting full, or saw that their hard drive was getting full, went into the synced library and deleted all of the files, a bunch of pictures from something, and then realized a couple of days later that delete was syncing up into Office 365, killed it immediately, was very embarrassed that they did it, and then tried to re-upload as many of those JPEGs as they could find, but then realized they didn't have them all. And then about a week after they did this, then they called us and said, we need to restore them. So there's a few things in here. So I connect, this time I did it as the admin because I just wanted to. But I used the whole get PnP recycled item. But again, it had been a week in here. So I got all the items, but then I had to figure out which ones to use. Well, it's a leaf name, so not a folder, not a site, but it's a file. It ends in JPEG. It came from this very specific place. It was deleted by this very specific person, and that gave me the list of documents that I needed to restore. So that was all saved here. I did this just to see how many there were. If I remember right, in the blog post might have very specific numbers. There was somewhere north of 90,000 of these. And so to restore them all, I did this. I said, take all those items for each of them, walk through, spit out the name of the file, just so I can kind of keep an eye on it, see where things are going, and then restore that item. And then at the end, get the date so I could see how long it was going to take. What I found was that went very slow, and it was going to take as long to restore them all as it took to delete them. It was going to take several days. So then I used another trick that I know is if you do this whole, if you have a collection of items, if you do this whole bracket thing, you can get a numbered subset of those. So I ended up breaking this 90,000 in $bin into 10,000 file chunks, and running it in different windows on the same box until I kind of got whereas the box was the bottleneck. And then I started running it on another host because it's all in the cloud. So I could run it on multiple machines. And then it took about 8 hours to finish it up because I broke it up into 10,000 file chunks, multiple windows, multiple machines. So that had some good stuff in that one there. So I don't have, so, and this, this is code. A couple of things I want to mention about this is it does syntax checking. It uses that. So it tells me, hey, you used for each, you should, or for each, you should have used for each object. All really handy stuff. Another thing, if you're moving from another, if you're using the ISE or whatever, I've got this set up the way that I want it. But if you go into the command palette, which is how you change things in code. So right click command palette. It brings this little guy up here up, and you can see the preferences, the color theme is something that you can change. I have added one called PowerShell ISE. And if you do that, not only does the bright light blind you, but then you get some of the color coding that you're used to with the ISE. So it's a little easier transition. I like the dark mode better, so I'm going to pick that one back there. But matter of preference. So I mentioned sometimes you've got multiple command lists that do the same thing, and this is a great example in trying to figure out which of the command lists that you should use. You can create an Office 365 group a couple of different ways. You can do SPO site. That creates a new SharePoint site, but it doesn't create a group-enabled site. So you get no group, no team, whatever. You can groupify it later, either in the interface or with PowerShell. If you do it with the PnP, new PnP site, create it that way. You get a group, that's good. So you get the Office 365 group. You don't get the team, but you can create the team later and teamify it later. If you create it in the Teams module, do new team, and then do it then. There you get the SharePoint site, you get the Office 365 group, you get the team, you get all of it. So the question of which module I use depends a lot on what exactly you're trying to do and which module supports the thing that you're trying to do the best. I'm not going to go over this, but this gives you a rudimentary how to save a site as a template and then apply it to another site. This one, I wish I had time to go over, but this is a way to copy Office 365 group permissions since you can't nest them. This one showed how to use the graph because there's some graph support in the PnP. I've got a blog post on this one. It's a really good one. Read that one through. And again, it's all in the slide deck. Getting flows, getting Power Apps, this kind of shows versus the user side. This is another example of if you want to disable the flow button, you're a horrible person. But if you do it, there's one way to do it with the SPO method, and then another way with PnP. They've actually got just disable flows on a site. So that is the schedule that I went 12 minutes over. I'm very embarrassed. All of that slide deck, all of that is available at that URL, at that QR code. I'm watching in Teams, so if you've got any questions or any words of adoration or anything, this is the time to do it. Paul, you're very welcome. Thanks. Amber, glad you liked it. Jim, same.
Does anybody have any questions? You can take yourself off mute to ask questions. I think I I was on my mute.
You're on the air.
Yeah. Anybody have any questions? Not everybody at once.
So Jack's got one. Is it possible to change a site URL using PnP? I do not believe so, and I'm going to walk a very fine line here. So the ability to change site URLs is in the SPO one. I don't remember if it's in PnP or not, but that's a great question, and that's kind of a process thing. So let's just do a live demo here. So I've got, that's terrible because that's very small. So let's do it in here. So I think I'm going to open up a terminal window here. Let's make sure everything works. So let's make sure I get SPO site. Okay, so that one worked. Just basically I'm checking here to see if the modules are loaded. So what I would do is I would do get command, the noun, SPO site. And I see that I've got, and I can't, oh boy, I think it's new SPO site rename. I forget the commandlet for that. But basically I would go through and find out what the commandlet was in SPO. There it is, start SPO site rename. And then see if there was a PnP version of that, because they do lag a little bit. So that's how you do it in the SPO PowerShell, SPO site rename. So then I would do something like get command noun, PnP rename, and I don't see anything. So it looks like there is not a way to do that in the PnP yet. This is a GitHub project, so you can absolutely go out there and create a request and have them do it. But that's the process that I would use if I was trying to do this in PnP. Good question. Any other questions? The other thing that I will tell you is I absolutely love doing this stuff. So if you have any kind of questions, feel free to hit me up on Twitter. I try to help people as often as I can. The chance that you're trying to do something completely novel and new is almost zero. So the thing that seems like a very intrusive question is probably something that somebody just knows off the top of their head. And we've all been there. I'm very compassionate to new folks because I've made every stumble. I've stepped on my toes 100 times with this stuff. So hit me up on Twitter. Happy to help if you've got questions. Any other questions before we sign off?
Sounds like we got a silent group.
Sounds good. Sounds good.
So Todd, thank you very much for taking, well, it looks like, well, it's been about an hour and a half, so I appreciate it.
I'm a tech guy, Dave, you know that.
No, that's fine. No, I really appreciate that. And I'm going to share my desktop real quick. At the end, sometime this afternoon, maybe I'll have a post up there on this website. This is our user group website, Omaha365.group. And I will have a post up there with a link to the recording. And I'll also probably tweet that out if you follow the user group site. Otherwise, like I said, we're still looking for a May presenter. Or if you have questions, topic requests or something like that, send me a message and we'll try to find somebody to speak on that topic. Otherwise, I really appreciate it. I'm going to turn recording off. I'm going to stop sharing. And there you can see my mug. And then let's see here, turn off the recording. Anyway, I appreciate everybody joining us today. And